If it's Tuesday, new details in the investigation into the deadly school shooting in Nashville that killed 6 people, including 3 young children, as authorities release new surveillance video and body camera footage from the tragic incident. Plus, banking, bailouts, and blame games. Top U.S. financial regulators testify on Capitol Hill as lawmakers try to get to the bottom of the historic bank failures that threatened a full-blown financial crisis. And politics and probes. Former Vice President Pence is ordered to testify about Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election as a potential Trump rival issues a stark new warning to his party. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We begin with disturbing new developments, new footage, and new reaction to yesterday's tragic school shooting that left 3 children and 3 adults dead at a private religious school in Nashville. Authorities today released this body camera footage of the horrific incident. It shows police entering the school before taking out the shooter just minutes later. That comes after police late yesterday released surveillance video showing the terrifying moments the shooter, 28-year-old Audrey Hale, entered the school by shooting through a locked door. At a press conference this afternoon, officials said they were still trying to determine Hale's motive. They said the shooter was under care for an emotional disorder and purchased a total of 7 guns legally. Authorities also noted the attack had been carefully planned using detailed maps and surveillance, though individual students were not targets.
We have no evidence that individuals were specifically targeted. This school, this church building, was a target of the shooter, but we have no information at present to indicate that the shooter was specifically targeting any one of the 6 individuals who were murdered.
Police also said they are continuing to analyze writings that were left behind. Nashville Police Chief John Drake told NBC's Lester Holt resentment may have fueled the shooter's motives. Take a listen.
We have belief, or we feel that very strongly that she went to school here in the Nashville area, and she went to that actual school, and so there's some belief that there was some resentment for having to go to that school. Don't have all the details to that just yet, and that's why this incident occurred.
Vigils have been held across Nashville for the victims, including the 3 children who were all 9 years old. Nashville Mayor John Cooper told my Today Show colleagues yesterday was his city's, quote, worst day. Take a listen.
In Tennessee, guns are essentially ubiquitous, and when guns and mental health issues come into contact with each other, you have big problems like we saw yesterday. And what is our worst day? Nashville's had challenges before. We've had tornadoes and floods. But when school children are attacked in their school, that's your worst day.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, President Biden today spoke to reporters before departing the White House about the administration's struggle to spur additional action from Congress on the issue of gun reform.
I have gone the full extent of my executive authority to do on my own anything about guns. But Congress has to act. The majority of the American people think having assault weapons is bizarre. It's a crazy idea. We're against that. And so I think that Congress should be passing an assault weapon. So I can't do anything except plead with the Congress to act reasonably.
President Biden addressed the shooting again just moments ago from the stage in North Carolina and again called for Congress to pass an assault weapons ban. The president has made similar calls to action after other mass shootings that have gone unanswered. As we said yesterday, the shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville was the 129th mass shooting in 2023 and sadly adds yet another dot to this map that we have to keep adding to every time one of these tragedies happens. It is a staggering visual there. Joining me now on the ground in Nashville is NBC's Katie Beck. Here with me on set is NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian, and NBC's Ryan Nobles is on Capitol Hill for us. Katie, I want to start with you. You have been on the ground there in Nashville. Bring us up to speed. How is the community coping today?
Kristen, the longer we stand here, the more and more families we see showing up, bringing their children, bringing flowers, paying respects at the foot of the school. It is heartbreaking to see parents try and explain to their children how the unimaginable is possible. They don't have the answers. They don't know what to say. It's a time where they could not have possibly been prepared for this scenario. And as you stated, the police chief speaking to us just a few hours ago, but unable to answer that critical question so many want to know why. What was the motive? We know there was a manifesto. We know there were writings. We know there were social media posts, but we still don't know exactly why this happened. We have seen students from neighboring schools who don't have school today coming over and tying red ribbons on trees, dropping sunflowers, talking, having conversations. There have been counselors who were at the reunification center yesterday watching parents wait to hear their children's name called. As children were safely found and identified, their names would be called and their parents would be reunified, just describing what those parents' faces looked like as they waited to hear their child's name. So it is a day of devastation here. Parents really grappling with this reality and how to explain it.
Katie, of course, there were a number of parents whose children did not come home yesterday, and we are learning more about the young victims, about the teachers who were killed. What can you tell us about those who lost their lives, Katie?
Yeah, one particularly moving interaction I had today was with a couple that came from Atlanta. They actually used to be co-workers with the head of this school, Catherine Kuntz, who was killed yesterday. And they said she was the most passionate and compassionate educator they had ever worked with. They are educators themselves and parents of 5 children. And they said when we heard this news, we had no other reaction but to get on a plane, but to come here and try and offer as many hugs and as many stories and as many anecdotes about Catherine as we possibly could. So that's what they were doing today. They were literally walking around trying to tell her story and talk about the fact that when someone's child was having difficulty, was maybe struggling in school, this was the educator you wanted to take hold, and how grateful they were that they had her hand take a part in their children's education who attended the school as well. So you're hearing these stories about these people, and they are becoming, real faces in this community that are deeply grieving their loss today.
And it is just so critical that we continue to tell their stories, Katie Beck. Ken, let me turn to you in the latest on the investigation. Katie obviously made the point that investigators still don't know the motive, what's behind this horrific mass shooting. They have found writings from the shooter, though. What can you tell us? How close are they to pinning this down? As I've been talking to people familiar with the investigation, I think it's more accurate to say they haven't reached a definitive conclusion about the motive. They've obviously read all these writings, although Police Chief John Drake, as he briefed reporters today, said that he personally hadn't read them all. But he did reveal some new information today. He said that Audrey Hale purchased 7 guns legally. Apparently, Audrey Hale lived with her parents, and I'm being careful about pronouns here because we're not sure which gender Audrey Hale expressed herself through. And that 3 of those guns obviously were used in the shooting, and that her parents were unaware that she had those guns. They were hidden around the house. And that when she left the house with a red bag, her mother didn't stop her because she didn't believe she had guns. She was on the way to shoot up at school. And we learned that she was under the care of a doctor for some kind of unspecified emotional disorder. But the chief also said that the police didn't know that, but had they known it, there was nothing in Tennessee law that would have empowered them to deny her right to have those assault rifles. And Audrey Hale, a former student at the school, and apparently there were maps drawn. I mean, this was something that was planned, according to authorities. Absolutely. This was meticulously planned. They had previously said she conducted surveillance on the school. She knew how she was going to make entry. She shot through the doors, as we saw on that video. And she was wearing camouflage clothing. She was carrying one rifle and had another strapped on her shoulder and a handgun. It was chilling and meticulous, and she came there with the intent to kill, police are saying. The video, absolutely chilling. What more did police glean from it? What more did they learn from the horrific, chilling video that was released? So they learned how she made entry, obviously, and you could also see, because she was walking around the school for several minutes, and we know this is a compressed time frame.
by one count, 14 minutes from the time the first 911 call came in until the time police engaged with the shooter. And so during that time, some of that time, she was walking around the school and finding no one to fire at, presumably because the school did a good job of getting those kids out of harm's way.
I think it's an important point because it is horrific that so many lives were lost. But given how heavily armed she was, you hear authorities say it could have been worse if the response time had been longer.
And we know that from Uvalde, where many, many more children were killed because there was an entirely different response. And when you look at the police body cam video, that was remarkable for its courage and competence that those officers displayed. That was everything that we would expect and hope that police officers would do. They rushed in immediately. Police officers with rifles and handguns converged on the shooter, took the shooter down. It's exactly what we did not see in the Uvalde situation.
A really important point. Ryan, let me turn to you. President Biden again calling on Congress to take action. Is there any sense, based on your reporting, based on your conversations, that given the nature of this tragedy, given that we are talking about 9-year-olds who lost their lives in yet another mass shooting, is there any sense that this time is different, Ryan?
You know, in many ways, Kristen, it feels like a rinse and repeat situation here. You know, I've been on Capitol Hill after many of these mass shootings, very similar to this one in Nashville. And we generally get the same response from lawmakers from both sides of the Hill. And one of those lawmakers I caught up with is Congressman Tim Burchett, who represents Knoxville. That's Tennessee, you know, a little ways away from Nashville, but in the same state. And I think he really crystallized, you know, the Republican view of whether or not gun control legislation is worth it. Take a listen.
Legislate evil, it's just not going to happen. We've got evil in this country. And everybody just needs to tone down the rhetoric a little bit, because all that does is gin it up in both sides, and then they point the finger and nothing happens. Because if you think Washington's going to fix this problem, you're wrong. They're not going to fix this problem. They are the problem.
It doesn't concern you that other countries don't have this level of gun violence?
Other countries don't have our freedom either.
So you kind of see what the congressman told me there in response to my question about the disparity between gun violence here in the United States versus countries around the world. And he argued it was a freedom issue, which to a certain extent describes a level of tolerance with this type of violence when it comes to the protection of the Second Amendment. And, you know, this is something, again, it's something we deal with over and over again, and there just seems to be a resistance to move forward at all. There was that bipartisan gun legislation that was passed in the last Congress. But I want to point you to kind of a moment here on Capitol Hill today, Kristen, that kind of crystallizes just how frustrated some are with the lack of progress in this space. And that was the Senate chaplain, Barry Black, who rarely finds the opportunity to inject politics into his morning prayer, the first prayer that is said as the Senate gavels into session. And he said in his prayer this morning, he said, quote, "When babies die, it is time to move beyond prayers." That was during his prayer this morning. So, Kristen, just an idea of that there is some frustration within these halls, but not necessarily enough frustration for any progress to be made.
Ryan, your exchange with the congressman was so important, and I'm so glad that you highlighted that from the chaplain today, because it was so incredibly rare. You're absolutely right to hear that from him. Quite a moment, and I just want to thank you all for your reporting on such an incredibly difficult story. NBC's Ken Delaney and Katie Beck and Ryan Nobles, we really appreciate it. We do want to note, if you or your loved ones are struggling with suicide or in emotional distress, there is help. The National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline provides free and confidential support 24 hours, 7 days a week. Just call or text the number on your screen, 988, to get connected. Again, that's 988. Coming up, U.S. bank regulators in the hot seat will have key moments from today's Senate hearing and my one-on-one interview with a lawmaker on Congress's role to help prevent the next potential financial crisis. That's next. Plus, first to NBC, a federal judge has ordered former Vice President Mike Pence to testify before a grand jury investigating Trump's efforts to subvert the 2020 presidential election results. What it means for the special counsel probe ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Right now, President Biden is heading back to Washington from North Carolina, where he touted his economic agenda and U.S. job growth during a visit to a semiconductor manufacturer. Meanwhile, back in Washington, lawmakers heard testimony from the nation's top bank regulators about the spectacular collapse of Silicon Valley Bank earlier this month and the government's emergency efforts to prevent it from spiraling into a full-blown financial crisis. Michael Barr, the Federal Reserve's vice chair for supervision, tried to reassure lawmakers that the banking system was sound as he pinned the bank's collapse squarely on its management and not the result of regulatory failures.
This is a textbook case of bank mismanagement. The risks the bank face, interest rate risk and liquidity risk, those are bread and butter banking issues. The firm was quite aware of those issues. They had been told by regulators. Investors were talking about problems with interest rate and liquidity risk publicly, and they didn't take the action necessary. They were quite vulnerable to risk, to shocks, and they didn't take the actions necessary to meet that. What happened on Wednesday night is they belatedly attempted to improve their liquidity position, and they did it in a way that spooked investors, that spooked depositors, that spooked the market.
Barr also revealed to the committee new details about the stunning speed and severity of Silicon Valley Bank's collapse as depositors rushed to pull their money out amid an absolutely massive and historic bank run.
The bank let us know that they expected the outflow to be vastly larger based on client requests and what was in the queue. A total of $100 billion was scheduled to go out the door that day. The bank did not have enough collateral to meet that, and therefore they were not able to actually meet their obligations to pay their depositors over the course of that day, and they were shut down.
NBC News business and data reporter Brian Chung joins me now. Brian, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So give us the big picture thinking here, particularly within the Biden administration. Is there a sense that this crisis has been contained at this point?
Yeah, Kristen, it's important to note that there were other regulators in that hearing as well. There was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Chair Marty Gruenberg, also the Treasury represented by Nellie Liang. And she said, for her part, quote, the actions that the government did to step in and take receivership of the two failed banks and ultimately sell them, quote, helped to stabilize deposits throughout the country and provided depositors with confidence that their funds are safe. So that does underscore that the Biden administration feels like the worst of this is past them. However, what's really interesting is just what we heard from in those two clips that you played, how severe the situation was at Silicon Valley Bank. Prior to today, we had not known that $100 billion were on its way out of Silicon Valley Bank on Friday, which really underscores how there was no possible way that the bank could have gone on without some sort of intervention. And we also heard separately that Signature Bank, which was the third largest failure in American history, had essentially an emergency loan sent to it by the Federal Reserve at the last minute before the window closed for them to be able to take that money on Friday, which is the only reason why they survived through the weekend. As you know, it ultimately was taken over by the government anyway on Sunday. So the FDIC saying that they really thought that there could be a contagion issue, but hopefully now that we're 2 weeks out from that with no other bank failures, maybe the worst is indeed past us.
Yeah, we know a lot of folks keeping their fingers crossed for that all across the country. Brian, I guess the big question is what to do about it. That's where the debate is right now. President Biden, of course, has called on Congress to take more actions, more regulations. Realistically, what do you expect to come out of this hearing today?
Yeah, well, there was an exchange with Senator Elizabeth Warren asking all three of those testifying today whether or not they felt that stronger bank regulations are needed. All three of them said yes, but that's not substantive when you consider that there's no serious policy proposals at the moment. Perhaps one way would be by imposing more stringent regulations on banks above $100 billion, which would have covered the likes of, for example, Silicon Valley Bank. But there are also other proposals, questions, for example, about whether or not the bank regulators have enough tools to be able to claw back any sort of compensation that was made by the CEOs. So that's going to be a big question down in Capitol Hill as well, Kristen.
It absolutely will be. All right. We know you'll continue to follow it. Brian Chung, thanks so much for your great reporting. Joining me now is Congressman Brad Sherman, Democrat from California and a member of the House Financial Services Committee, which will hold a hearing tomorrow on the recent bank failures. Congressman, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I want to get your reaction to what you heard today. What was your key takeaway and how will it impact what you ask tomorrow?
Well, the Fed should be attuned to interest rate risk since they, more than anyone else, actually control the interest rates. Mr. Barr said that this was a classic case of bank mismanagement. He's right, but it's also a classic case of misregulation. He says that the regulators gave good advice to the bank that the bank wouldn't take. Well, he's not a consultant to the bank. He's a regulator. When the bank regulators give the bank good advice and they don't take it, it's time to shut down the bank or tell the bank to take the advice or they will be shut down. And this bank could have hedged its risk on these long-term bonds anytime last year at substantial cost to the bank, and then they'd still be alive today. Instead, they didn't want to bear that cost. They wanted to take the risk that they wouldn't need that insurance, and they wanted to increase their bonuses, their earnings per share, and now they become a problem for the federal government.
So I hear you saying it is both, that it was mismanagement, but also the lack of regulations. I know, and I want to follow up with your comments about the Fed, but let me just talk about the regulations first. You proposed a number of regulations, including restoring some of the key Dodd-Frank protections that were in place, requiring interest rate stress tests, for example, closing regulatory loopholes, requiring transparency and accountability from federal bank regulators. What, if any, ideas do you think actually stand a chance of passing through Congress, if any?
I think that we're going to force interest rate resiliency testing on banks. I'm hoping that we're able to go back to stress testing the banks of between 50 or perhaps 100 and $250 billion. And we've got to get away from this crazy notion that whether you have a bank holding company or structure yourself without a bank holding company depends upon on that issue depends upon how you're regulated. It's a silly difference that shouldn't be decisive.
Just to challenge you on that point, though, Congressman, I've spoken to folks on Wall Street who say that, look, the issue is not slapping more regulations on medium-sized banks, that ultimately that would overburden those banks and punish them for what was essentially mismanagement by SVB. How do you respond to that criticism?
We had the tougher regulations of mid-sized banks in progress from right up until 2018, and we didn't have this failure. What's punishing mid-sized banks right now is the example of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. People are worried. People are, in some cases, taking their money out. That's what's punishing the mid-sized banks. We need to have certainly interest rate change stress testing of medium-sized banks. And as a result of those stress tests, it can't just be that the regulators give them advice. No, the regulators have to insist that action be taken. If you take the action, you shut them down.
Congressman, would a stress test have prevented this crisis? Was it not about having more liquidity?
Stress test your liquidity. If this problem had been caught a year ago and they had seen, hey, the bank has a problem, it's got to take corrective action, we wouldn't be talking about them now. That's what's supposed to happen. Now, if they did a stress test that left out the obvious test, I mean, if you test a building for earthquake and you don't test it for flood and there's a flood, well, you didn't do the right kind of stress testing. Number one stress test has got to be interest rate changes, especially if you're the Fed, since you're pretty attuned to interest rate change.
Since you raised the Fed again, it sounds like you disagree with some of their handling of the financial situation writ large. Do you disagree with their decision to raise rates?
There's two Feds in effect. There's the Federal Reserve you often cover. What are the interest rates going to be? There's also a Fed that was the primary bank regulator. That's why we're talking to Barr tomorrow instead of Powell. Powell spends most of his time focusing on what the interest rates for the country should be, whereas Barr's job is the chief bank examiner and supervisor and regulator of Silicon Valley Bank. And in his testimony, he outlined how they knew there was a problem. They told the bank to solve the problem. The bank didn't. And then they just sat there and they watched the bank not solve the problem.
Broadly speaking, though, what is your reaction to how the Fed has responded to interest rates and the fact that they recently raised rates?
I think the quarter point was the right thing to do. If they had gone zero, that would have signaled that, oh my God, the banking system is in such terrible shape that the Fed is unwilling to raise rates even though we still have inflation. And if they had done 50 basis points, people would say, oh my God, can the banks handle 50 basis points? The 25 basis points was the Goldilocks. They handled that. And I think that their interest rate policy, while painful, because we have to deal with inflation and that's painful, is the right one. But the bank examination here was just awful. This was a failure to take the basic steps and a failure to compel the bank to take the basic steps.
Congressman, based on what you heard today, do you think anyone from Silicon Valley Bank should face criminal charges?
I think they should face a clawback of their compensation. And unfortunately, we're going to have to correct the laws. They provide for clawback, but they're designed to deal with situations where the bank holding company is subject to the resolution. In this case, it's the bank itself. There are too many loopholes in our clawback. No bank official should be able to keep excess compensation collected within 3 years of when the bank goes under.
All right, Congressman Brad Sherman, we will be watching very closely tomorrow. Thank you for being here.
Good to be with you.
Up next, new reporting on what the Manhattan grand jury is doing and new legal developments in the special counsel's investigation of former President Trump with the reporter who broke the story. Next, you're watching Meet the Press Now. If Donald Trump gets indicted in New York, it doesn't look like it will be this week. 3 sources familiar with the matter tell NBC News a Manhattan grand jury investigating the alleged hush money payment to Stormy Daniels is not expected to meet tomorrow. It's expected to meet Thursday, but we'll hear testimony on a separate matter, and the grand jury typically does not meet on Fridays. We are following a potentially major development in the special counsel Jack Smith's criminal investigation into former President Trump. NBC News was first to report a federal judge has ordered former Vice President Pence to comply with a subpoena and testify before a grand jury about the former president's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. That's according to a source familiar with the ruling. But the ruling was a partial win for Pence. He will not have to answer questions about his role on the day of the insurrection as he presided over the Senate. NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett helped break that story, and she joins me now. Laura, it's so good to see you. So break this down for us. How big of a victory was today's ruling for the special counsel?
So this is a significant win for the special counsel, Kristen, because he's been trying for months to get at these conversations both before and after the election between Trump and Pence. The former president has long maintained that those conversations should be shielded by executive privilege, the privilege that lets him have sort of open deliberation between his senior aides. Multiple courts have dismissed that idea, and Judge Boasberg yesterday dismissed that idea as well, saying it's not valid. But what he did acknowledge was that Pence's sort of novel constitutional argument that he is entitled to some immunity, given the fact that he actually presided over the Senate as president of the Senate on January 6th. He said, look, that is true. He did do that, but it doesn't stop him from testifying about any alleged illegality that happened in those conversations with Trump. So if Trump is discussing ways for Pence to sort of thwart the election and the special counsel believes that's illegal, he can testify about that.
Okay, Laura, let me ask you about another investigation Jack Smith is conducting into the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. Former President Trump was on Fox News overnight. He was asked about this. I want to play you a little bit of what he said and get your reaction on the other side.
Sure.
I can't imagine you ever saying, bring me some of the boxes that we brought back from the White House. I'd like to look at them. Did you ever do that?
I would have the right to do that. There's nothing wrong with it.
But I know you. I don't think you would do it.
Well, I don't have a lot of time, but I would have the right to do that. I would do that. There'd be
All right, let me move on.
Remember this.
Yeah.
This is the Presidential Records Act. I have the right to take stuff.
I have the right to take stuff. What do you make of that from a legal perspective, Laura?
I think the Justice Department and lawyers would disagree with the former president on that. I imagine that his own attorneys are sort of shaking their head about why he's going on national television saying things like that. Obviously, he's under criminal investigation for this very issue of the retention of classified documents and potential obstruction of justice about instructing his own lawyers about what to do with those documents and representations that those lawyers made to the Justice Department. So I think it is fraught territory to into discussions about that in the midst of a criminal investigation, Kristen.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see how closely they are watching that. Laura, very quickly, do we have any sense of when Pence might testify?
It's a great question. I've been trying to press for more reporting on that today. You know, the special counsel had some urgency in doing this. Obviously, you wouldn't go after the former Vice President of the United States unless you were pretty sort of in the end days of this investigation. I think it's fair to say this has sort of reached an advanced stage at this point. So I imagine that they would try to get him in pretty quickly, but I don't have a firm timetable of when exactly he will go into that grand jury room.
All right. Well, Laura Jarrett, fantastic scoop. Thank you for joining us to discuss it. We really appreciate it. Yeah. All right, I want to bring in our panel now. Joining me on set is Camila DeChalis, congressional reporter for The Washington Post, former Maryland Democratic Congresswoman and NBC News political analyst Donna Edwards, and former Illinois Republican Congressman Rodney Davis. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. Really appreciate it. Camila, let me start with you and let you just set the table here. There is a thinking that if former President Trump can get through these investigations and potential indictments, that he will likely soar to the nomination. What does your reporting tell you about the impact of these investigations?
Well, especially when I'm talking to voters throughout the country and really asking this question of whether they're still going to rally their support about Trump and whether these investigations may hinder or possibly just put more questions or doubts on their support of him, they say simply this, that they are not going to rule him out because there's still no conclusions of these investigations. Still no formal charges have been brought against the former president. And you've seen even in the past few days since he's made that announcement on his social media about a possible arrest, he's actually even used that to his advantage to raise more money. So, you know, there's this two mindsets I've talked to Republican voters about. One is that there's still a lot of support for the former president, and I think that's something that all Republican parties should kind of take note at. Another side is just saying that, you know, maybe just in light of all of the bad press and these investigations on the former president, maybe it's time for someone new to step in and really, you know, they've been throwing out names like Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis as just possible contenders that they kind of shy away from other possible investigations, that they're just not as prone to the press that he's getting.
Rodney, what's your reaction to the development that former Vice President Mike Pence will have to testify? Laura Jarrett says still working on figuring out when the timing of that might happen, but that's significant.
Well, very interesting. I think some of the conversations that the vice president had with the president and the president's team before January 6th are going to surprise a lot of Americans. I mean, it's interesting because I was a teller on January 6th with the vice president standing behind me when we completed our job and we fulfilled our constitutional duty. Mike Pence is a very brave man, and Mike Pence is, there's one thing about Mike Pence, and I know Donna served with him, he tells the truth.
Donna, let me have you weigh in there and get your reaction to how the Democrats are responding or not responding. I mean, to some extent, they're largely staying on the sidelines while we wait to see if the former president is indicted.
Well, and I think that's completely appropriate. I think most Democrats have agreed that, do agree that we should let the justice system independently handle these investigations and let them come out where they are. I've talked to a lot of Democrats who are like not on indictment watch. They're waiting to see how the justice system plays out, and they're willing to give it that chance.
I want to play a soundbite of former President Trump justifying his post-warning of death and destruction. Camila, you talked about the fact that he's kind of trying to play the refs here. I want to play that and get everyone's reaction on the other side.
I will say this with death and destruction. I didn't say death and destruction. I said, I'm afraid. Yeah. I said, I'm afraid that if they do this, which is a fake prosecution, where my worst enemies say that he's totally innocent. I didn't say do something bad. I say I am afraid that people will do something because people are very angry about it.
A lot of people heard tones of January 6th when he talked about death and destruction. He's trying to backtrack a little bit there, but I guess there's a question about whether that will work or whether it will infuriate independents and moderate Republicans who he would need to win a general election.
Right. I was actually on Capitol Hill that day, and I spoke to several Republican lawmakers and asked them about that, of what they make about his recent comments that day. And it's this. Some of them said that they weren't aware of the post, so they can't comment on it. But then others struck this tone of denouncing the remarks that he made, saying that they are not calling for any violence, that everything should be peaceful. So they were almost doing this dance of creating some distance between him and the remarks he's making, but making sure that they're not completely icing him out and completely, criticizing the former president himself.
Rodney, Republicans, so many of them still afraid to completely ice him out. This weekend, he was at a rally in Waco, Texas, stood with his hand over his heart while images of January 6th were playing. I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, the former President Trump, he likes to play victim. And when he is the victim of investigation after investigation, impeachment after impeachment, he thinks that motivates his base. Remember, President Trump is not going to be able to build his vote base of support right now. So what he has to do is bring every other candidate to a lower level than him to win. And right now, most Republicans, when you look at all polling, they do not want President Trump to be the nominee. However, he has that minimum base of support, and he knows if he can make Ron DeSantis answer questions about January 6th, if he can make Nikki Haley and anyone else who's thinking about running, it helps to bring them down rather than move him up. It's a race to the bottom, Kristen.
Well, speaking of polling, let's look at some polling on the Democratic side. Donna, according to the Monmouth poll, 44% of Democrats want Biden to step aside and let someone else run for president. But over half, 51% of Democratic voters don't know who they want to see as a nominee. So the question is, I mean, the polling's really striking there. There's really no alternative. And yet you have more and more Democrats coming forward and saying, they don't want to see the current president.
I don't know. Most elected Democrats that I talk to are not having that conversation. And the fact that people are saying they want somebody else, but they can't identify who, Democrats don't want to engage in a food fight. There's a food fight going on the other side. We want to watch that. We don't want to participate in it.
But are Democrats concerned when they see those numbers, Donna? Because I hear what you're saying about elected officials. And you're right to point out that publicly, at least, we are hearing elected Democrats really coalesce around the president, particularly when they get asked about him running for re-election. But when you look at the voters, it's a different story.
Well, I think voters naturally are kind of looking at, they're looking ahead, whatever that next generation might be. But I think most Democrats agree that, the president needs to run on his record. Democrats are going to rally behind that. Everybody's just waiting for him to get in to know that for sure he is in it. And I think then you'll see a change in some of these polling numbers.
Camila, what's your take on how much concern is there amongst Democrats when they look at these numbers?
I think when you talk to any constituent, whether voter, when they're looking at Republican contenders for 2024, they know that there is a need, especially with the Republican voters I talk to, for the need for new blood. And so then they reflect on their own party and say, could that be the case for Democrats as well? Some things I've been hearing from some Democratic voters is Biden's age and some concern around that, especially if he completes another 6-year term.
And there are concerns about how he's going to engage in the so-called culture wars, right? There's some real discussion about, there's a thinking that he should stay above the fray, according to our reporting. But they haven't really worked out how to answer some of those criticisms.
And that's correct. But then you've seen it be very effective for the Republican Party. You look at the Virginia governor, Glenn Youngkin. This is something he campaigned on and really galvanized a crowd. I was in Oregon for the governor's race. And that was something where they really thought that seat, the governor's seat, was going to flip red for the first time in 50 years. But they talked a lot about education. And when I talked to voters there, they said no matter what state you turn to, parents are concerned about what their kids are learning. So it's something we've seen Republicans do really effective. And we're going to be watching whether Democrats can kind of combat that message or come up with their own messaging around that issue.
Rodney, final point to you. Do Republicans, moderate Republicans in particular, have concerns that the culture wars could be taken too far?
In certain areas and certain aspects. When it comes to certain issues, I think moderate Republicans are like, hang on, let's take a step back. Let's realize who our new base is. When you start talking about labor union issues, for example, most members of the building trades in America, and especially where I live, they're Republicans now. So this anti-union rhetoric is something that moderate Republicans hope that our party would back off from. But in the end, some of the culture war issues, they transcend politics right now, and they go right to the heart of middle America. And those are the issues that I think most Republicans are okay with fighting on.
So you don't think there's going to be a change in strategy, it sounds like?
Well, there's got to be an overall strategy of who's going to be our candidate. Remember, and lastly, polling has shown that right now, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are both beating President Biden right now in a one-on-one matchup. That should concern every Democrat.
All right. Great conversation. Thank you so much. And of course, that's one poll you're citing. There are many different polls. Camilla, Donna, and Rodney, we really appreciate it. After the break, we are live in Kyiv as the top defense officials testify on the Hill about the threat from Russia. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Defense Secretary Austin and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley were on the Hill today defending the president's budget, but also addressing a range of issues, including the Pentagon's strategic competition with China and America's continued support for Ukraine amid rising tensions with Beijing and Moscow. Their testimony comes as today the Wall Street Journal reported the U.S. will no longer share data on its nuclear forces with Russia after Moscow suspended its participation in New START, a nuclear arms control treaty. U.S. officials told the Journal it's the first action by the administration in response to Russia's suspension. Meanwhile, the UN nuclear agency chief is in Ukraine this week and will be making his second visit to Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, a situation he has described as precarious. Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley in Kyiv. So, Matt, you spoke with the IAEA Director General today. So what are some of his biggest concerns? What were your key takeaways from the interview?
Yeah, I mean, of course, his main concern is the integrity of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is the largest power plant in Europe, and it's situated right on the front lines, right at the interface between the Russian invasion and Ukrainian defenders. And, of course, Kristen, when it comes to Ukraine and nuclear energy and nuclear disasters, this country is really once bitten, twice shy. And this is, we all remember Chernobyl, and that is why this is really an acute memory for so many people here. And so when it comes to protecting this massive nuclear power plant. And again, this is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. There are so many threats, not just aerial bombardments, which are coming fast and furious all over this country, but also just the movements of the front line. The Ukrainians, and this is one of the interesting things. He wasn't just laying blame on the Russians, even though he is a United Nations body, or the IAEA is. He mentioned that also the Ukrainians have to be careful, too. The United Nations have been very, very critical of Russia's role in this invasion. But he said that the Ukrainians need to also be very careful because as this battle line moves back and forth, and it very well could in the coming weeks and months, that it could go right over and back over that nuclear power plant. And that could really put this entire region, quite a bit of the world, in very real danger from a nuclear meltdown. Kristen?
So important that you had that conversation. Matt, let me ask you, Ukraine confirms they have now received tanks from the UK and Germany. The big concern has been, would the tanks arrive? Would they be operational by spring when it's expected that Russia will ramp up its fighting? What is your assessment and what are top officials' assessment of the fact that they now have those tanks?
Yeah, well, Kristen, we've got tanks now from Germany, from those Challenger 2 tanks from Britain, and we just saw the Minister of Defense here in Ukraine kind of driving around, almost doing donuts in this open field. He put it on social media, and he said it drove like a Rolls Royce. We've got infantry fighting vehicles, including the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles from the U.S. So all of these weapons are part of a suite, a package of really advanced technology that are coming from the West. And you mentioned that there could be a Russian offensive. Actually, we're really looking more at a Ukrainian offensive to push back the Russian lines. And as more of those weapons come in, the Ukrainians are confident that they can use this new technology to push the Russians back to their original border from long before this invasion. Kristen?
All right, Matt Bradley, thank you. Please do continue to stay safe. We appreciate it. Still to come, U.S.-Israel tensions on the mend after Prime Minister Netanyahu announces a, quote, timeout on his government's controversial judicial overhaul plans following weeks of demonstrations. We'll have details ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to postpone a vote on the controversial judicial overhaul package until Parliament's next session appeared to calm some tensions in Israel today. It comes after weeks of widespread demonstrations and strikes escalated over the weekend, paralyzing the country Monday. The U.S. has welcomed the delay. This afternoon, President Biden said he hopes Netanyahu acts to work out a compromise. And a senior administration official tells NBC News the White House believes Israel's government has likely abandoned the divisive overhaul plan and says Netanyahu is now motivated to work toward alternatives with broader support. Joining me now is Ambassador Dennis Ross, counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former special assistant to President Obama. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
I want to start off by getting your reaction to NBC's reporting that the White House believes Prime Minister Netanyahu has abandoned his judicial overhaul plan. Is that realistic? Is that a misreading of the situation to see this as anything more than a pause?
Right now, I would say it's a pause. It's not an abandonment. If it was really perceived as an abandonment, he would probably see his government break up. And I think he's going to try hard to preserve the government. It may not be sustainable because in the end, if you don't have some kind of compromise, you're going to see a replay of what we were seeing before. I mean, Israel was going from being the startup nation to being the shutdown nation. And the reality is that's the last thing that he wants. It's the last thing Israel can afford. And it can't afford to be sending a signal of this kind of disunity affecting even the military. We've already seen signs from Hezbollah in Lebanon that they might, in fact, be motivated to test the Israelis. So I think there is a need to figure a way out. I think the prime minister sees that, but he has certain constituencies within this government. They're going to resist that. I think we'll see an effort made to negotiate a compromise, at least on the judges selection committee. We began to see today, by the way, for the first time, direct conversations between representatives of the prime minister and representatives of the leaders of the opposition, hosted by the president of Israel. So this was a beginning. These talks were described as being conducted in a good climate. That doesn't mean we're on the brink of a breakthrough. I don't think that's the case. Any negotiation always tends to go down to the wire. But I do think there is going to be an effort to see what can be done. And I think the prime minister ultimately will have to make some hard choices.
I want to ask you about what we've seen from the Biden administration, because some officials in the U.S. and in Israel think that the president has been too cautious. Do you think the president has struck the right tone publicly, or does he need to be tougher in his public comments?
I think he struck the right tone. There's a balance to be struck here. If it looks like we're telling the Israelis what they're going to do domestically, then you could actually create some pushback. No question, the opposition wanted the prime minister to understand what the cost would be internationally, and especially in the U.S. relationship at a time when Israel is looking at greater and greater threats from the Iranians, especially on their nuclear program. They can't have a dissonance with the United States right now. And I think they wanted some sign that this was an issue that mattered to the United States and to the relationship. But if we were seen as pushing too hard, then, as I said, some people who otherwise might feel, look, we need a compromise, might also feel, look, we can't afford to have the United States or anybody on the outside tell us what, in fact, we're supposed to do on the inside.
As you point out, there are discussions going on right now in Israel that could go down to the wire. What do you anticipate we will see in the meantime? Should they be bracing for more protesters in the coming days?
We're not going to see an end to protests completely, because many of the protesters will feel that if they give up what is the leverage they've created, that the government might feel they can go ahead and succeed with their proposal as it stands, or only with very minute changes. On the other hand, you're not seeing the general strike. The size of the demonstrations will change. They'll only recoup if it looks like the government isn't negotiating in good faith. And I think, as I said, the need to demonstrate that there's a serious effort to produce compromise will actually have an effect not only on the government, but also the opposition representatives as well. No one could look like they want to sustain the disunity.
And can you just help us understand, finally, it seems like firing the defense minister really pushed things over the brink. Was that the tipping point here? And we have just less than a minute.
I think we were right on the edge of that. And then to have the Minister of Defense, who's responsible for Israel's security, saying the security is being threatened and I cannot be a party to that, that was too much. We saw spontaneous turnout of more than 100,000 people. We saw an agreement between the laborers and other labor unions and the business people, which we've never seen before. That was the key point.
All right. Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you so much for your perspective. We really appreciate it. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.